imagine an 8-year-old girl vanishes into thin air. I mean, she just completely disappears.
Right.
Now, imagine that at the exact moment she goes missing, her family is actively being monitored by 5 different government agencies.
Yeah, which is just, it's hard to wrap your head around.
Exactly. We are talking about schools, child welfare workers, housing authorities, behavioral health departments, and a city-run family shelter.
Mm-hmm.
How does a child slip through a safety net when she is, standing right in the dead center of it?
It is a really chilling contradiction.
Hmm.
Usually when we look at these kinds of tragedies, we find a family living entirely off the grid, right? Like completely isolated from social services.
Yeah, exactly. The invisible family.
Exactly. But the reality we're looking at today is the exact opposite. This isn't just a true crime story about a predator. It's a profound, devastating anatomy of a systemic failure. It's a story where the safety net was basically made of these impenetrable silos.
Well, welcome to today's deep dive. We're examining the tragic disappearance of 8-year-old Relisha Rudd back in March of 2014. It all starts at Payne Elementary School, where Relisha was a second grader.
Right.
By mid-March of 2014, this 8-year-old had missed over 30 days of school.
Which, 30 absences is an astronomical amount of missed education for a young child.
Yeah, a month and a half of school, basically.
Exactly. But the school hadn't escalated it to an absolute emergency level yet.
Right, because of her mom.
Yeah. Relisha's mother, Shamika Young, had an ongoing excuse. She claimed her daughter was suffering from this complex, mysterious neurological issue. And she told the school Relisha was under the strict care of a Dr. Tatum.
She even provided the school with a phone number for this doctor. And for weeks, that thin facade actually worked.
Which is crazy.
It is. It held the bureaucracy at bay completely. Until March 19th. That is when a school social worker named the LeBone Workman decided a phone number just wasn't enough anymore.
Right, he needed physical proof.
Exactly. He needed to meet this Dr. Tatum face-to-face. So he actually traveled to the D.C. General Family Shelter, which is where Relisha's family had been living for about a year and a half.
And that physical visit is the exact moment that shattered the deception.
Yeah.
Workman arrives at the shelter, walks up to the staff, and asks to speak with Dr. Tatum. And the staff just look at him in total confusion.
Because there is no doctor.
Right. There is no doctor treating patients at the shelter. There is, however, a janitor named Khalil Tatum, a 51-year-old man whose job is literally to clean the floors.
So the moment Workman realizes the so-called neurologist is the shelter's janitor, the authorities are immediately called in.
Yeah, panic sets in.
Police confront the mother, Shamika, and she pivots to a completely new story. She suddenly claims Relisha and Dr. Tatum are out of town together, attending a medical conference in Atlanta.
Which is just, it's an incredibly bizarre lie for a mother to tell about her young child and a janitor.
Exactly.
Investigators immediately pull surveillance footage, and the terrifying reality comes into focus. Relisha wasn't in Atlanta. The last confirmed sighting of her was nearly 3 weeks earlier on March 1st.
Wow.
Yeah. She is seen on security camera footage at a Holiday Inn Express walking down a hallway with Khalil Tatum.
The timeline here just stops you in your tracks. While the city is finally launching this massive search for Relisha, Tatum goes on the run.
Right.
And the details that investigators uncover over the next few days are, honestly, the darkest climax imaginable. They track Tatum's movements and discover he had actually murdered his own wife, Andrea.
It's just horrific.
They find her body left in a motel room in Oxon Hill, Maryland. And then police look at what Tatum was doing on March 1st, the exact day Relisha was last seen on camera.
This is the part that is just chilling.
Yeah. They find out he went to a store and purchased extra-large 42-gallon contractor trash bags and a significant quantity of lime.
Yeah, and for anyone unfamiliar with forensic decomposition, lime is a chemical substance often used by killers specifically to speed up the breakdown of a human body.
Right.
And it masks the odor of decay. So buying it on the exact day a child disappears, it paints a horrifying picture of premeditation.
It turned the search into an absolute nightmare scenario. The manhunt eventually leads authorities to Kenilworth Park and Aquatic Gardens.
Which is huge.
Massive. They spent days tearing through the 700-acre park. We are talking dive teams in the water, cadaver dogs searching the brush, specialized cameras being fed underground into pipes and drains.
It's just a massive operation.
Yeah. And on March 31st, they finally find Khalil Tatum. He is dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound using the exact same gun he used to murder his wife.
But Relisha was not with him.
Oh.
After all those resources, all those searches, she was nowhere to be found. And, she remains missing to this day.
It is a completely devastating sequence, and it really forces us to zoom out from the crime itself. I mean, how does a 51-year-old janitor gain such unfettered, unquestioned access to an 8-year-old girl in a city-funded family shelter?
Right.
We have to look at the environment that made this possible. We have to look at D.C. General.
What's fascinating here is the history of the physical space itself, because it was never actually designed to house vulnerable families.
Oh, really?
No. D.C. General was originally founded way back in 1806 as a poorhouse and a hospital.
Wow, 1806.
Yeah. It operated as a public hospital all the way until 2001 when the city closed it to cut costs. And shortly after that, they took this massive, chaotic institutional medical facility and simply repurposed it into a homeless shelter.
I feel like repurpose is doing a lot of heavy lifting there.
Oh, definitely.
Because they just crammed hundreds of families into these old hospital wards. At its peak, there were up to 600 children living in this building.
Yeah, 600 kids.
And the sources describe the conditions as absolute grim misery. It was filthy, infested with vermin, plagued by crime, and get this, they didn't even have a playground for these 600 kids to use.
When you take hundreds of displaced, economically desperate families and just warehouse them in an abandoned hospital, you create an ecosystem of supreme vulnerability.
Right.
It is an environment that predators actively seek out
Yeah.
because they know the people inside are desperate for resources and attention.
Which brings us to Khalil Tatum's employment file. I assumed that to work in a facility with hundreds of vulnerable children, you'd need like a spotless background check.
You would think so.
But Tatum had spent over a decade in prison. He had a serious criminal history for felony burglary, larceny, and breaking and entering. How does a guy like that get hired?
He got hired because of a glaring blind spot in D.C. law at the time.
Of course.
The law required stringent background checks for what they called safety-sensitive positions, roles directly involving the care or supervision of children. But because Tatum was hired as a janitor, his role was classified as maintenance. He wasn't technically supervising anyone, so his criminal record did not disqualify him from walking the halls of a family shelter.
That is just maddening. Because he's holding a mop, the system assumes he's invisible to the children.
Right, but he wasn't invisible at all. The Reddit discussions and the news reports are full of stories from other residents about how Tatum operated.
Yeah.
He didn't act like a janitor. He would walk around the shelter dressed up in suits and vests, playing the role of a wealthy mentor. He targeted young girls specifically. He would hand out gifts, give them cash, buy them tablets, and even offer to pay for manicures.
That is classic grooming behavior. He is identifying a need in a deprived environment and presenting himself as the provider.
Exactly. Now, many of the families living at D.C. General saw right through this. They recognized the red flags instantly and strictly barred Tatum from coming anywhere near their children.
But Shamika Young allowed it. She actually embraced it. She referred to Tatum as Relisha's goddaddy. She claims she wanted Tatum to care for Relisha to get her away from the filthy conditions of the shelter. And Relisha's stepfather, Antonio Wheeler, actually went on record noting that when he would come back into town from work, Shamika would mysteriously have cash on her.
Right.
And she openly admitted to him that Tatum was the one supplying the money.
This is where that heavily redacted D.C. government report provides some really crucial insight into the shelter's management. The facility was run by an organization called the Community Partnership, and they did have a fraternization policy.
Okay.
It strictly prohibited staff from having personal relationships with the residents.
Let me guess, the policy had a massive loophole.
A catastrophic one, yeah.
No.
The policy forbade the behavior, but it did not explicitly require staff members to report other employees if they witnessed a violation.
Oh, you have got to be kidding me.
No. So other shelter workers almost certainly saw Khalil Tatum, a janitor, hanging around an 8-year-old girl and her mother.
Yeah.
But because their employer didn't mandate them to blow the whistle on a colleague, nobody said a word.
Just a complete diffusion of responsibility. Everyone assumes someone else will handle it.
Exactly.
But as horrific as the shelter environment was, Relisha wasn't trapped exclusively inside D.C. General. She was going to a public school. She was known to the child welfare system. She was surrounded by mandated reporters.
Yeah, and that brings us to the critique from the Child Welfare Monitor DC, which is arguably the most frustrating piece of this entire puzzle.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the DC Child and Family Services Agency, CFSA, didn't just have a passing familiarity with Relisha's family. They had an open, active in-home services case on them the exact month she vanished.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and by interesting, I mean deeply enraging. We are talking about a single anonymous tip that got brushed off here.
No.
The sources detail 3 sustained, verified reports of abuse and neglect over the years in 2007, 2010, and 2013.
The documentation is severe. Social workers physically entered the home and found inadequate food. They documented environmentally unsafe conditions, describing floors covered in trash and cigarette butts.
Oh.
And they found small children being allowed to bathe themselves completely unsupervised,
Yeah.
which is a massive drowning risk.
And it wasn't just environmental neglect. The 2013 report noted severe verbal abuse from Shamika, constant cursing at the kids, and physical violence. One of the children had been thrown to the ground, splitting his lip open and slapped in the face.
Yeah.
I have to stop you here, because looking at this from the outside, it just feels like madness. If a social worker walks into a room, sees a kid with a split lip, unsupervised toddlers in a bathtub, and trash everywhere, how do they not take those children out of that environment immediately?
Well, it is the most difficult tension in the entire child welfare system. And the Child Welfare Monitor article highlights this beautifully.
Okay, how so?
Agencies like CFSA are under immense systemic pressure to prioritize family preservation over child removal.
Right.
And that pressure doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from a very real, heavily documented history of over-policing in marginalized communities, where Black families in particular have been torn apart unnecessarily by the state.
So the pendulum swings the other way. Instead of removing the kids, they try to fix the home.
Precisely. They opt for in-home services. The philosophy is that offering resources like parenting classes or food assistance heals the family unit without the trauma of foster care.
Which makes sense in theory.
It does.
Uh-huh.
But the fundamental flaw in Relisha's case is that if you choose the in-home monitoring route, the monitoring actually has to happen.
Right, which means a social worker is supposed to be laying eyes on these kids constantly.
Yes, usually twice a month.
Yeah.
But Relisha disappeared on March 1st. She wasn't reported missing until March 19th.
God.
That is almost a 3-week gap where an active CFSA caseworker supposedly managing this highly vulnerable family simply did not notice the 8-year-old was gone.
Did they just take the mother's word that Relisha was safe without physically demanding to see her?
It seems that way. And the school's role in this timeline just compounds the failure.
Yeah, let's talk about the truancy delays. Because Relisha hits her 10th unexcused absence on March 13th. By law, D.C. Public Schools is mandated to report that level of truancy to CFSA within 2 business days.
But DCPS delayed making that report. They officially admitted they held off to give Shamika more time to gather the medical notes from this fake Dr. Tatum.
But even when the school finally does report the educational neglect, CFSA drops the ball again. They receive the truancy report and they don't treat it as a high-priority emergency.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
And why? Because Relisha's younger brothers were still showing up to class.
It is a textbook example of confirmation bias within a bureaucracy.
Mm-hmm.
The agency sees the brothers attending school and assumes the family unit is generally functioning. They write off Relisha's absence as an isolated medical issue, rather than viewing the truancy as a glaring, screaming red flag in a family with a documented history of severe neglect.
Have you ever heard of the Swiss cheese model of systemic breakdown?
I have, yeah.
In safety engineering, they teach that every defense mechanism is like a slice of Swiss cheese. It has holes in it. Usually the holes don't line up, so a problem gets stopped by one of the layers.
Right.
But in a true disaster, the slices align perfectly, and the hazard passes straight through every single hole.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that analogy perfectly describes the findings of the D.C. government report.
Yeah.
The investigation revealed that 5 different agencies were actively engaged with Relisha's family in the months leading up to her disappearance. You had the Community Partnership running the shelter, CFSA handling child welfare, the Department of Behavioral Health, the Department of Human Services, and the public schools.
So if you are listening to this right now and you work in a corporate office, think about how often the marketing team has no idea what the sales team is doing.
Right. All the time.
You have different departments sitting in the same building, totally isolated. Now imagine those corporate silos are government agencies, and their lack of communication is the only thing keeping a child alive.
That is exactly what happened. These 5 agencies operated in absolute silos. They did not share information. They did not conduct joint assessments. They rarely convened interagency meetings.
It's totally blind to each other.
Exactly. And the reason they didn't talk to each other was because of disjointed confidentiality policies. Privacy laws designed to protect the family's health and educational data essentially became brick walls.
Wow.
No single caseworker had a complete 360-degree view of the family's functioning.
It creates a labyrinth of blind spots for a predator to navigate. And speaking of blind spots, we have to talk about the nightly bed checks at the shelter.
Oh, this part.
This detail from the government report is just unbelievable. To maintain your placement at DC General, families had to be present for a nightly curfew check.
But the shelter staff were not identifying the children by name. They were simply doing a numerical head count.
Think about how absurd this is in practice. A shelter worker opens a door at night, shines a flashlight, sees a few lump-shaped silhouettes under the blankets, checks a box on a clipboard, and walks away.
Yeah.
They have no idea if the 8-year-old assigned to that bed is actually the one sleeping in it. It could be a pile of clothes. It could be a different child entirely.
And because of that mechanical, dehumanized process, the official report uncovered a staggering statistic. Relisha and her siblings were actually absent from the shelter more than 50% of the time.
Wait, really? More than half the time?
More than half the month, yeah. And the shelter operator had no official record of it because a simple head count completely masks the identities of the missing children.
To truly understand how this family ended up in a place that counts lumps under blankets instead of human beings, we have to look at the research from the Urban Institute. Because homelessness doesn't just happen overnight.
No, it doesn't.
They trace the family's timeline back years before the disappearance.
Yeah, the Urban Institute discovered that the family actually had a housing subsidy for years. But between 2007 and 2012, they suffered 5 different evictions for lease violations and unpaid rent.
Yeah.
The final blow, the eviction that cost them their housing voucher entirely and forced them into DC General, was caused by a bureaucratic delay in appointing a representative payee.
Wait, I need you to explain this to me. If the government is giving them a subsidy to pay the rent, what is a representative payee and why would a delay in getting one cause them to lose their home?
Well, the housing authority eventually realized that Shamika could not responsibly manage the benefit payments to keep the rent current.
Right.
So the agency required a representative payee, a designated third party, to be appointed to receive the funds and directly pay the landlord on her behalf.
That makes sense.
It does. But the bureaucracy delayed processing the paperwork, and Shamika actively refused to consent to the arrangement for months.
So an administrative standoff over a signature pushed a family with severe documented vulnerabilities out of a subsidized home and into a chaotic, predator-rich shelter.
Exactly. And the Urban Institute points out that this specific moment is where a different systemic approach could have changed everything. They propose a model called supportive housing.
How does supportive housing actually intercept a crisis like that?
Traditional housing subsidies just write a check for the rent. Supportive housing combines permanent subsidized housing with a dedicated lead case manager.
Ah.
That manager's entire job is to coordinate all those different silos: mental health, child welfare, schooling into one unified plan.
So someone is actually looking at the big picture.
Yes. If Relisha's family had supportive housing, one single person would have known about the eviction threat, the truancy at school, the open CFSA abuse reports, and the shelter conditions, all at the exact same time.
They would have seen the entire safety net instead of just staring at their one single strand.
Precisely. A lead case manager reacts to the holistic needs of the family to prevent crises, rather than having 5 different agencies reacting blindly to isolated emergencies after the damage is already done.
So what does this all mean for you? Whether you are in corporate management trying to align departments, a healthcare provider managing patient care, or someone volunteering in your community, the lesson of Relisha Rudd is universal.
It really is.
Throwing multiple, uncoordinated resources at a complex problem is often as ineffective as doing nothing at all. If the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing, the most vulnerable people slip right through the cracks. True support requires synthesis and relentless communication.
The aftermath of this tragedy did force the city's hand eventually. Mayor Muriel Bowser and the D.C. City Council moved to close D.C. General. It took years of phased transitions, but the massive shelter was finally shut down for good in late 2018.
And the community refuses to let Relisha be forgotten. Local advocates, led by figures like Henderson Long, continue to observe Relisha Rudd Remembrance Day every single year on July 11th.
Yeah.
The Metropolitan Police Department and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children are still actively soliciting tips, and they continue to investigate leads a decade later.
We've examined the horrific actions of Khalil Tatum, and we've walked through the systemic failures of truancy delays, in-home monitoring, and shelter loopholes. But this raises an important question, and it comes from a haunting line buried in the conclusion of that D.C. government report.
What did it say?
After investigating every failure and recommending dozens of policy changes, the authors concluded that even if all their recommended changes had been in place at the time, the tragedy might still not have been preventable.
Wow. That is a devastating admission from the people running the system. And it leaves us with this final thought to haul over. If a massive government system can technically follow all of its own rules, checking the head count boxes, holding the agency meetings, filing the truancy paperwork, and still lose an 8-year-old girl in plain sight, are we designing our safety nets to actually protect the vulnerable, or are we just designing them to protect the agencies from liability?